James continues with another sermon. This one is on temptation. Now, the word that he uses is the very same word that he used back in verse 2. New Living Translation translates that appropriately as troubles. Those were troubles that came from the circumstances in which we live. In verse 12, James said, God blesses those who patiently endure testing and temptation. Afterward, they'll receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. And remember, when you're being tempted, don't say, God is tempting me. God is never tempted to do wrong. He never tempts anyone else. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions. When sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. So don't be misled, my dear brothers and sisters. Whatever is good and perfect comes down to us from God our Father, who created all the lights in the heavens. He never changes or casts a shifting shadow. He chose to give birth to us by giving us his true word. And we, out of all creation, became his prized possession. Now, James here talks about temptation and what to do when we have temptation. The first thing that James says deals with the source of temptation. In verse 14, it comes from our own desires. Temptation is born within us through envy and jealousy. We see something else that we want, whether that's power, or whether that's beauty, or whether that's a possession, and we desire it. We want it. That becomes a temptation for us. The result of temptation, James says in verse 15, when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. Now it's interesting here. James differentiates between temptation and sin. Temptation can come, and it's unfortunate when it does, but it will come. That doesn't mean that we have to give way to sin. We don't have to allow sin to grow in us. When it does, it leads to death. So what do we do about temptation? How do we deal with temptation? In verse 12, James says, God blesses those who patiently endure. First thing that we do with temptation is we endure it. It's a desire within us. We can't run from ourselves, so we endure it. We face it. We stand up to it. Jesus himself talks about this in the book of Mark, chapter 13, verse 13. Jesus says, everyone will hate you because you're my followers, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. We are to endure. We're to put up with it. We're to face it. We're to tolerate it, but not yield to it. The second thing that James says in verse 17, whatever is good and perfect comes to us from God the Father. It's like James is saying when you're in the midst of temptation, don't dwell on the temptation. Dwell on the good and the perfect. Paul says the very same thing in the book of Philippians, chapter 4, verse 8, when he says, now, dear brothers and sisters, one final thing. Fix your thoughts on what's true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. Instead of dwelling on the temptation, we should find the good and the perfect and dwell on that. That comes to us from God the Father. How do we deal with temptation? First of all, we stand firm. Secondly, we don't dwell on it. We go to what is good and perfect, and we dwell on that. Hey, good luck in facing temptation today. It comes in all sorts of sizes and varieties. Dwell on the pure, perfect things of God and stand strong in the face of temptation.